When Michael Torres told me he was leaving me for my sister Jessica because she was more financially successful and independent, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because of the crushing irony. For 3 years, I had been secretly funding every designer purse, every luxury dinner, every Instagram-worthy vacation that made Jessica look like the successful woman Michael thought he was getting. He was choosing her wealth over our relationship, never knowing that her wealth was actually mine. What I did next exposed not just Jessica's lies, but the truth about who really deserved his respect. And honestly, watching both their worlds crumble was more satisfying than any relationship I could have saved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain air at Red Rocks Amphitheatre was crisp that October evening, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant sounds of Denver traffic below. Michael had driven us up here after dinner, claiming he wanted to show me something special before the venue closed for the season. We sat on the iconic red sandstone steps, looking out over the city lights that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The amphitheater was empty, except for a few other couples scattered across the massive natural formation, and there was something almost sacred about the silence between us. I remember thinking how perfect everything felt in that moment. Michael's hand was warm in mine, and after 2.5 years together, I had finally stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. We had talked about our future countless times, about the house we might buy in Park Hill, about whether we wanted kids, about growing old together in this city we both loved. He worked as a software developer for a startup downtown, and while his income wasn't extravagant, combined with my accounting salary, we had built a comfortable life together. Simple, maybe, but real. That evening, Michael seemed different. There was an energy about him, a nervous excitement that I had attributed to work stress, or maybe plans for the upcoming holidays. He kept checking his phone, fidgeting with something in his jacket pocket, and stealing glances at me when he thought I wasn't looking. The sunset painted the rocks around us in shades of gold and amber, and I found myself thinking that this was exactly where I wanted to be. Exactly who I wanted to be with. We had been sitting in comfortable silence for maybe 20 minutes, when Michael suddenly stood up and turned to face me. His dark eyes were bright with something I couldn't quite read, and his hands were shaking slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket. The moment felt suspended in time, like the universe had paused to let something important happen. I could hear my own heartbeat over the distant hum of the city below, and suddenly I knew what was coming. When he dropped to one knee on those ancient red rocks, with the lights of Denver sparkling behind him like a constellation, I felt something inside me settle into place. This was it. This was the moment I had been quietly hoping for but never daring to expect. The ring was simple but beautiful, a classic solitaire that caught the last rays of sunlight and threw them back in tiny rainbows. His proposal was everything I had dreamed it would be. Heartfelt and personal, and uniquely ours. I said yes without hesitation, not because I felt pressured or because it seemed like the next logical step, but because every fiber of my being knew this was right. We held each other on those rocks as the sun finally disappeared behind the mountains, and I remember thinking that nothing could touch this moment. This was ours. This was real. This was the beginning of everything I had worked toward and hoped for since the day I met him at that work happy hour downtown. We drove back to my apartment in Capitol Hill that night with the radio playing softly and my new ring catching the streetlights every time I moved my hand. Michael kept reaching over to squeeze my fingers, as if he needed to convince himself this was really happening. We stayed up until almost 3 a.m, talking about everything and nothing, making plans and dreaming out loud about our future. I fell asleep curled against his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat and feeling more secure than I had in years. The next morning, I woke up with that same sense of rightness, like the world had shifted into better alignment while I slept. Michael had already left for work, but he had left a note on my coffee maker telling me he loved me and couldn't wait to start planning our life together. I spent the entire drive to my office downtown thinking about how I would tell people, who I would call first, where we might want to have the ceremony. The ring felt substantial and reassuring on my finger, a physical reminder that good things really did happen to people who waited and worked for them. At work, My best friend Amanda practically screamed when she saw the ring during our morning coffee run to Onyx Coffee Lab. She had been rooting for Michael and me since the beginning, always telling me that she could see how much he loved me in the way he looked at me. Amanda was the kind of friend who remembered important dates and always knew exactly what to say when life got complicated. She had been there through every milestone of my relationship with Michael, celebrating the good times and offering perspective during the rough patches. That Tuesday felt like the first day of a new chapter. I remember sitting at my desk at the accounting firm, working on quarterly reports but finding myself distracted by the way the morning light hit my engagement ring. My boss, Mr. Davidson, noticed my distraction and smiled knowingly when he saw what had captured my attention. He congratulated me warmly and mentioned that his wife had been engaged around my age, that these were some of the best years of life. Everything felt aligned, purposeful, full of promise. I decided to call my parents that evening to share the news. My mother Linda answered on the second ring, and I could hear the familiar sounds of dinner preparation in the background. My parents had immigrated from Taiwan when I was just a baby, working tirelessly to build a life for Jessica and me in the suburbs of Lakewood. They had always emphasized education, hard work, and family loyalty above everything else. The American dream, they called it, and they had sacrificed everything to give us opportunities they never had. When I told my mother about the engagement, her reaction was everything I had hoped for. She was thrilled, immediately wanting to know every detail about the proposal, about the ring, about Michael's plans. She called my father to the phone, and I could hear the pride in both their voices as they congratulated me and welcomed Michael officially into the family. They had always liked him, appreciating his work ethic and the respectful way he treated both me and them. This felt like the natural progression of something they had been quietly hoping for. But then my mother asked the question I had been dreading without even realizing it. "Have you told Jessica yet?" she asked, and something in her tone shifted slightly. It wasn't disapproval exactly, but there was a carefulness there that hadn't been present moments before. "You know she's been having such a difficult time lately with her business. I just want to make sure she's in a good place to hear happy news." Jessica. My younger sister, the Instagram influencer with 25,000 followers who documented her glamorous life across Denver's trendiest spots. Jessica, who lived in a luxury high-rise in Lodo and drove a BMW and wore designer clothes that cost more than my monthly rent. Jessica, who always seemed to have money for the latest restaurants, the most exclusive gym memberships, the spontaneous weekend trips to Aspen or Santa Fe that filled her social media feeds with envy-inducing content. Jessica, who had been calling me for money every single month for the past 3 years. The conversation with my mother suddenly felt heavier, weighted with implications I didn't want to examine too closely. Jessica had always been the more outgoing sister, the one who made friends effortlessly, and seemed to navigate social situations with an ease I had never possessed. She was beautiful in an obvious way, with long black hair and perfect makeup and a wardrobe that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Next to her, I had always felt practical, sensible, maybe a little boring. But lately, Jessica's success story had started to feel increasingly complex. Yes, she posted constantly about her freelance marketing business, about the clients she was supposedly landing, and the campaigns she was developing. But she also called me regularly with urgent requests for financial help. Her rent was late, her car payment was overdue, a client had delayed payment, and she needed grocery money. Every month, like clockwork, came the calls and the Venmo requests and the promises that this was temporary, just until her business got more stable. I had never questioned it because I loved her and because helping family felt like the right thing to do. My parents had raised us to take care of each other, and Jessica's struggles felt genuine. The freelance marketing world was unpredictable, I reasoned. Cash flow issues were normal for someone building their own business. And Jessica always seemed so grateful, so embarrassed to be asking, so determined to pay me back once things turned around. 3 years of monthly transfers, $2,000 here, $3,000 there, sometimes more when she had what she called emergencies. I had calculated it once, late at night when I couldn't sleep, and the number had made me feel sick. Close to $80,000, maybe more. Money that had come from my steady accountant's salary. from my careful budgeting and my sacrificed vacations and my thrift store clothes. But sitting there with my engagement ring catching the light from my apartment window, I pushed those thoughts away. This was my moment, my happiness, my future with Michael. Jessica's financial struggles were separate from this, and I wasn't going to let worry about her business problems overshadow the best thing that had happened to me in years. I told my mother I would call Jessica soon, that I wanted to share the news in person, and we ended the conversation on a warm note with promises that they would take Michael and me out to dinner to celebrate properly. That night, Michael came over with Chinese takeout from our favorite place in Capitol Hill, and we spent the evening looking at engagement ring styles online and talking about wedding venues. He was excited in a way I rarely saw him, animated and full of ideas about where we might have the ceremony and who we would invite. We talked about keeping it small and intimate, maybe somewhere in the mountains where we both felt most at home. Nothing too elaborate or expensive, just something meaningful shared with the people who mattered most to us. As we sat on my couch with our laptops open and takeout containers scattered around us, I felt that same sense of rightness I had experienced at Red Rocks. This was what happiness felt like, I realized. Not the dramatic, Instagram-worthy kind of happiness that Jessica seemed to chase, but something quieter and more sustainable. The kind of happiness built on compatibility and shared values and genuine affection. The kind that could last. Michael left around 11 that night, kissing me goodbye at my door and telling me he loved me in that soft, certain way he had. I watched him walk down the hallway toward the elevator, noting how his shoulders seemed straighter, how there was a spring in his step that hadn't been there the week before. Getting engaged had changed something in both of us, I thought. It had given us permission to start planning concretely for a future we had only dreamed about before. I spent the next hour tidying my apartment and getting ready for bed, my ring still feeling foreign but wonderful on my finger. Tomorrow I would call Jessica and share the news. Tomorrow I would start thinking about wedding plans in earnest. Tomorrow I would begin the process of becoming Mrs. Sarah Torres, a thought that made me smile every time it crossed my mind. I fell asleep that night feeling grateful for everything I had built, everything I had earned, everything that was finally falling into place after years of patience and hard work. The last thing I remember thinking before sleep took over was how lucky I was to have found someone who loved me for exactly who I was. Someone who didn't need me to be more glamorous or more exciting or more successful than I already was. Someone who saw value in my quiet stability, my financial responsibility, my loyalty to family. Someone who wanted to build something real and lasting, not just something that looked good on social media. If only I had known then what Michael really valued, and how easily those values could be redirected towards someone who only appeared to possess them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I decided to call Jessica the next evening after work, wanting to share my engagement news while the excitement was still fresh. I had spent most of Wednesday thinking about how to tell her, rehearsing different ways to bring up the subject that would feel natural and warm. Jessica and I had always had a complicated relationship, the kind that oscillated between genuine sisterly affection and an undercurrent of competition that neither of us ever directly acknowledged. But this felt like a moment that could bring us closer, a chance to share something joyful that had nothing to do with money or stress, or the complicated dynamics that sometimes crept into our conversations. I called her around 7 in the evening, after I'd gotten home from work and settled in with a cup of tea. She answered on the 4th ring, sounding slightly out of breath and distracted. In the background, I could hear music and voices, the kind of ambient noise that suggested she was out somewhere trendy and bustling. Jessica was always out somewhere, always at a networking event or a gallery opening or a restaurant launch that she needed to document for her Instagram followers. "Sarah? Hey," she said, and I could hear her moving, probably stepping outside or into a quieter area. "What's up?" "I'm actually at this amazing pop-up dinner at the Source right now. The chef is supposed to be the next big thing, and I'm trying to get some content for my story. Can I call you back later?" I hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish for expecting her to drop everything for my news. But then I remembered the weight of the ring on my finger, and the way Michael had looked at me when I said yes, and I decided to push forward. "Actually, I have some news I wanted to share with you. Good news. Are you able to talk for just a few minutes?" There was a pause, and I heard her say something to someone else, her voice muffled, as if she had covered the phone. When she came back, her tone was slightly more focused but still distracted. Okay, sure, what's going on? Michael proposed, I said simply, unable to keep the smile out of my voice. Last night at Red Rocks. We're engaged. The silence that followed was longer than I expected, long enough that I started to wonder if the call had dropped. When Jessica finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled, like she was measuring each word before releasing it. Oh, wow. That's really great, Sarah. Congratulations. When did this happen exactly? I launched into the story of the proposal, describing the setting and the ring and the way it had felt to say yes to spending my life with someone who truly knew me. But as I talked, I became increasingly aware that Jessica wasn't really responding with the enthusiasm I had hoped for. Her comments were brief and non-committal, punctuated by long pauses that felt heavy with something I couldn't identify. She asked practical questions about timeline and venue preferences, but there was a flatness to her tone that made my excitement start to deflate. Have you told Mom and Dad yet? She asked when I finished describing the proposal. Yes, last night. They were thrilled. Mom wants to take us out to celebrate this weekend, maybe to that new place in Cherry Creek you're always posting about. Another pause. Right. That makes sense. Jessica's voice had taken on a quality I recognized but couldn't quite place, something distant and slightly sharp around the edges. So I guess you'll be planning a wedding now. That's going to be expensive. The comment caught me off guard, not because it was untrue, but because it seemed like an odd thing to focus on. Well, yes, eventually. We're thinking something small and simple. Nothing too elaborate. Small and simple still costs money, Jessica said, and now there was definitely an edge to her voice. Especially if you want it to be nice. Have you thought about how you're going to pay for everything? I mean, with your current expenses and everything. I felt a familiar knot form in my stomach, the one that always appeared when conversations with Jessica took this particular turn. My current expenses. She meant the money I had been sending her, the monthly transfers that had become such a routine part of my budget that I barely thought about them anymore. But hearing her reference them now, in the context of my engagement, made something twist uncomfortably in my chest. We'll figure it out, I said carefully. We have some time to plan and save. Right, Jessica said again, that same flat tone. Well, I should probably get back inside. This dinner is actually really important for my business. I'm trying to book this chef for a campaign I'm developing, and I need to make sure I get some good shots of the food. We ended the call shortly after that, with Jessica promising to call me later in the week to talk more about the engagement. But as I set my phone down on my coffee table, I felt strangely deflated. This wasn't how I had imagined sharing my news with my sister. I had expected excitement, maybe even tears of joy. Instead, I felt like I had somehow inconvenienced her, interrupted something more important with my personal happiness. I tried to shake off the feeling as I made dinner and settled in for the evening. Jessica was busy with work, I told myself. She was probably just distracted by the networking opportunity, and would be more enthusiastic when we talked again. But deep down, I couldn't escape the feeling that her reaction had been calculated, that the pauses and the careful tone had been covering something else entirely. The next few days passed in a blur of congratulations and excited conversations with friends and coworkers. Amanda took me out for celebratory drinks at our favorite wine bar in Reno, where she peppered me with questions about wedding plans and insisted on examining my ring under every available light source. My colleagues at the accounting firm were warm and supportive, with several of the older women sharing stories about their own weddings and offering advice about vendors and venues. But underneath all the celebration, I found myself thinking about Jessica's reaction more than I wanted to. Something about our conversation had felt wrong, loaded with subtext I couldn't quite decode. I kept replaying her comments about expenses and money, wondering if she was worried about how a wedding might affect my ability to continue helping her financially. The thought made me feel guilty and resentful in equal measure. Guilty for potentially putting her in a difficult position, and resentful that her financial situation had somehow become a factor in my engagement joy. It was Friday afternoon when Jessica finally called me back. I was just finishing up my last client review of the week when my phone buzzed with her name. This time, she sounded more like herself, warmer and more present. though there was still something underneath her cheerfulness that felt slightly forced. "I'm so sorry about the other night," she said immediately. "I was just completely overwhelmed with work stuff, and I don't think I reacted the way I should have to your amazing news. I've been feeling terrible about it all week." I felt some of the tension I had been carrying start to ease. This was more like the Jessica I knew, the one who could be thoughtless sometimes but who ultimately cared about our relationship. "It's okay," I said. "I know you were busy." "No, it's not okay," she insisted. "This is huge news, and you deserved better than my distracted response. I want to take you out to celebrate properly. Are you free this weekend? Maybe we could do brunch at Snooze and then some shopping. I want to hear everything about Michael's proposal and start thinking about bridesmaid dresses." The gesture felt generous and genuine, and I found myself smiling for the first time since our last conversation. This was what I had been hoping for, the sisterly bonding and excitement that should have come with sharing such important news. We made plans to meet Sunday morning at the Snooze location in Cherry Creek, close to where Jessica lived in her high-rise apartment. Sunday morning was crisp and bright, with that particular quality of light that made Denver's mountains look close enough to touch. I drove to Cherry Creek feeling optimistic about the day ahead, looking forward to spending time with Jessica without the usual undercurrent of financial stress that seemed to creep into our conversations. I had even worn my new ring prominently, excited to show it off and answer questions about the proposal. Jessica was already seated when I arrived at the restaurant, looking effortlessly put together in a way that always made me slightly self-conscious. She was wearing what looked like a new sweater, soft cashmere in a shade of camel that complemented her complexion perfectly, paired with jeans that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Her hair was styled in loose waves, and her makeup was flawless despite the early hour. She looked like someone who had stepped out of a lifestyle blog, which, I supposed, she essentially had. She stood up to hug me when she saw me approaching, and her enthusiasm felt genuine this time. She immediately grabbed my hand to examine the engagement ring, making all the appropriate excited noises and asking detailed questions about the proposal. For the first hour of brunch, everything felt normal and celebratory. We ordered mimosas and shared stories about Michael's romantic gestures, and Jessica seemed genuinely interested in hearing about our relationship timeline and future plans. But as the meal progressed, the conversation began to shift in ways that felt familiar and uncomfortable. Jessica started talking about her own romantic situation, about how difficult it was to meet quality men in Denver when you were focused on building a business. She mentioned how impressed she was by Michael's stability and career success, how rare it was to find someone so financially responsible and ambitious. "He's really established himself well," she said, cutting into her avocado toast with careful precision. "Software development is such a secure field, especially here in Denver. And he seems like the type who's probably really good with money, really thoughtful about financial planning." I nodded, though something about the way she was talking about Michael made me slightly uncomfortable. It felt analytical, like she was evaluating him rather than simply celebrating our relationship. But I pushed the feeling aside, attributing it to my own sensitivity about money, given our family's complex financial dynamics. After brunch, we walked through Cherry Creek Mall, ostensibly to look at potential bridesmaid dress options, but mostly just to spend time together. Jessica was in her element here, navigating the high-end stores with the confidence of someone who belonged in these spaces. She pointed out dresses and accessories with an expert eye, suggesting color palettes and styles that would work well for a mountain wedding. But I noticed that she also seemed to be performing, stopping frequently to take photos of herself in front of various store displays, checking her phone constantly for likes and comments on her Instagram stories. She was documenting our sister bonding time with the same careful attention she gave to her solo lifestyle content, turning our private celebration into public content for her brand. At Nordstrom, while Jessica was trying on a dress she claimed she might wear to my wedding, I found myself looking at the price tags of the clothes she had been casually recommending. $400 for a bridesmaid dress, $600 for the sweater she thought would look good on me, $800 for the boots she had tried on, just for fun. These weren't just expensive items. They were luxurious in a way that felt completely disconnected from the financial struggles Jessica had been describing to me for years. I thought about the Venmo request I had received from her just last week, $2,000 to cover her rent and car payment because a client had delayed paying an invoice. I thought about all the times she had called me in tears about her inconsistent income and the stress of freelance life. But looking at her now, confidently evaluating luxury items and talking knowledgeably about brands and designers, I felt a disconnect that I couldn't quite reconcile. When we left the mall that afternoon, Jessica hugged me goodbye and promised to start thinking seriously about wedding planning and bridesmaid responsibilities. She seemed more like herself again, more engaged and sisterly than she had been during our phone conversation earlier in the week. But as I drove home to my modest apartment in Capitol Hill, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about our day together had felt performative. Like Jessica had been playing a role rather than simply being present with me. That evening, Michael came over for dinner, and I told him about my day with Jessica. He listened with the patient attention that was one of the things I loved most about him, asking thoughtful questions about wedding planning and expressing genuine interest in meeting Jessica properly now that we were engaged. She had been mostly absent from our relationship so far, always too busy with work or travel to join us for the casual group dinners and social events that made up our social life. She sounds like she's doing really well for herself, Michael commented when I mentioned Jessica's knowledge of the Cherry Creek shopping scene. The freelance marketing business must be picking up if she's shopping at those kinds of places. I paused, suddenly unsure how to respond. Michael didn't know about the money I had been sending Jessica, about the monthly transfers that had become such a routine part of my budget. It wasn't that I had deliberately hidden it from him, but it had never come up naturally in conversation, and something had always made me hesitant to discuss it. Maybe because I knew how it would sound, how difficult it would be to explain why I was supporting my apparently successful sister's lifestyle. Yeah, I said finally. She's been working really hard to build her client base. But even as I said it, I felt the uncomfortable weight of the half-truth. Jessica was working hard at something, but I was starting to wonder if it was building a business or simply maintaining an image. The thought made me feel disloyal and suspicious, qualities that didn't come naturally to me and that I didn't like recognizing in myself. It was 2 weeks later when everything began to unravel, though I didn't recognize it as unraveling at the time. I was at work on a Thursday afternoon, deep in quarterly tax preparations, when my phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. The message was brief but urgent, in a way that had become familiar over the years of our financial arrangement. Sarah, I need to talk to you tonight if possible. Had a client emergency and I'm in a really tough spot. Can you call me when you get off work? I sighed, recognizing the tone and knowing what was coming. Another financial crisis. Another unexpected expense or delayed payment that would require another transfer from my carefully managed budget. I had been hoping that with my engagement and upcoming wedding expenses, these requests might become less frequent. But Jessica's business seemed to lurch from crisis to crisis, with predictable regularity, always requiring just a little more help to get over the next hurdle. I called her that evening as promised, and she answered immediately, sounding stressed and scattered in a way that triggered my protective instincts, despite my growing fatigue with these conversations. She launched into a complicated story about a major client who had unexpectedly pulled out of a campaign at the last minute, leaving her without the payment she had been counting on to cover her monthly expenses. I know the timing is terrible with your engagement and everything, she said, and I could hear genuine distress in her voice. I feel horrible asking for help right now, when you probably want to be focused on wedding planning. But I'm really stuck, Sarah. I need $4,000 to cover my rent and car payment and basic expenses until I can find replacement clients. $4,000. It was more than she had ever asked for at once. A significant chunk of money that would strain my budget even more than usual. I thought about the engagement ring on my finger and the wedding we were starting to plan, about the venue deposits and dress shopping and all the expenses that were starting to accumulate. I thought about Michael's excited planning and the future we were building together. But I also thought about Jessica, alone in her expensive apartment, struggling with the unpredictable nature of freelance work. I thought about family loyalty and the values our parents had raised us with, about taking care of each other when times got difficult. Despite my growing discomfort with the pattern we had established, I couldn't bring myself to say no when she needed help. Okay, I said finally. I can transfer it tonight. The relief in Jessica's voice was immediate and overwhelming. She thanked me repeatedly, promising that this was temporary, that she was working on stabilizing her client base, and wouldn't need to ask for help much longer. She mentioned several potential new clients she was in talks with, big companies that could provide the steady income she needed to get back on her feet financially. But as I hung up the phone and logged into my banking app to make the transfer, I felt a heaviness that went beyond the financial strain. This pattern had been going on for 3 years now, and Jessica's business never seemed to actually stabilize. There were always new crises, new clients who didn't pay on time, new emergencies that required immediate financial intervention. I was starting to wonder if I was enabling rather than helping, if my consistent support was actually preventing Jessica from finding real solutions to her professional challenges. I made the transfer that night, but for the first time, I didn't feel good about it. Instead, I felt used and resentful and guilty about feeling resentful. I lay awake next to Michael, who was sleeping peacefully and unaware of the financial transaction that had just significantly impacted our wedding budget, and wondered how I had gotten trapped in this cycle of supporting my sister's lifestyle while sacrificing my own financial security. The next morning, I checked Jessica's Instagram out of curiosity, something I rarely did but felt compelled to do after our conversation. What I saw there made my stomach drop. Posted just hours after our phone call about her financial emergency was a series of photos from what looked like an expensive dinner at one of Denver's most exclusive restaurants. The captions talked about celebrating a successful client meeting and treating herself to a night out after a productive work week. I stared at the photos for a long time, trying to reconcile the Jessica who had called me in financial distress with the Jessica who was posting about expensive dinners and successful business meetings. The timestamps didn't make sense, the narrative didn't align, and for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge that something was seriously wrong with the picture my sister had been painting of her life. But it was the next post that truly shattered my understanding of our relationship. Jessica had posted a photo of herself getting her nails done at an upscale salon, with a caption about the importance of self-care and maintaining a professional appearance for client meetings. But it wasn't the post itself that devastated me. It was one of the comments from a friend congratulating her on her recent promotion and asking about her new executive role at some marketing firm I had never heard of. A promotion. An executive role. While I had just sent her $4,000 for basic living expenses because her freelance business was supposedly failing. I screenshot the posts and the comments, though I'm not sure what I plan to do with them. The evidence felt important somehow, like documentation of a betrayal I was only beginning to understand. But as I sat in my car in the parking lot of my accounting firm, staring at the images on my phone, I realized that this was bigger than just one inconsistent story or one misleading social media post. This was a pattern of deception that had been going on for years, funded by my own generosity and enabled by my unwillingness to ask difficult questions. And as I thought about Michael and our engagement and the life we were trying to build together, I realized that I had been living in two different realities. One where I was building a stable future with someone I loved, and another where I was pouring my financial resources into a sister who had been systematically lying to me about her life. The question now was what I was going to do about it, and whether I was strong enough to handle the answers I was about to uncover. The screenshots sat in my phone's photo gallery, like evidence of a crime I wasn't ready to prosecute. For 3 days after discovering Jessica's contradictory social media posts, I carried around the knowledge of her deception like a physical weight. I would catch myself staring at the images during quiet moments at work, trying to make sense of the timeline. The expensive restaurant photos posted hours after she had called me sobbing about being unable to afford basic necessities. I hadn't told Michael about any of it. Every evening, he would come home from work excited to discuss wedding venues or guest lists, and I would force myself to engage with the planning while this secret knowledge churned in my stomach. How could I explain that I had been secretly funding my sister's lifestyle for 3 years? How could I admit that the woman he thought was a struggling entrepreneur was potentially living better than we were, all on money I'd carefully saved from my accounting salary? It was Amanda who finally forced me to confront what I had discovered. We were having our usual Friday coffee at Onyx, sitting at our favorite table near the large windows that looked out onto the busy street. I had been distracted all week, barely present during our conversations, And Amanda had the kind of observational skills that made her excellent at reading people's moods. "Okay, what's going on?" she said, setting down her latte and fixing me with the direct stare that meant she wasn't going to accept evasive answers. "You've been weird all week. Is everything okay with Michael? Are you having second thoughts about the engagement?" "No, nothing like that," I said quickly. "Michael's great. The engagement is great. It's just family stuff." "Jessica stuff," Amanda said, and it wasn't a question. She had been my closest friend for 4 years, had listened to countless conversations about my complicated relationship with my sister, though she didn't know the extent of the financial support I had been providing. What did she do now? I hesitated, unsure how to explain without revealing details I had never shared with anyone. But looking at Amanda's concerned face, I realized I needed to tell someone, needed an outside perspective on what I had discovered. So I pulled out my phone and showed her the screenshots, explaining about the expensive dinner photos posted hours after Jessica's tearful call asking for money. Amanda studied the images with the careful attention she usually reserved for complex spreadsheets at work. Her expression grew increasingly troubled as she scrolled through the posts and read the comments about Jessica's supposed promotion and executive role. When she finally looked up at me, her face was serious in a way that made my stomach clench. "Sarah," she said slowly, "how long have you been giving her money?" The question hung in the air between us, and I felt heat rise to my cheeks. This was the conversation I had been dreading, the one where I would have to admit the full scope of what I had been doing. "A while," I said weakly. "How long is a while? And how much are we talking about?" I told her everything then, about the monthly transfers that had started 3 years ago, about the emergency requests that had become routine, about the total amount that had grown to somewhere around $80,000. Amanda's eyes widened as I spoke, and I could see her doing the mental math, calculating what that money could have meant for my own life, my own future with Michael. "Jesus, Sarah," she said when I finished. $80,000? That's like a down payment on a house. That's a year of living expenses. Why didn't you tell me this was happening?" I shrugged, feeling defensive and embarrassed. "She's my sister. Family helps family. I thought her business was just having growing pains, that eventually she'd get stable and wouldn't need help anymore." "But look at these photos," Amanda said, gesturing to my phone. "This isn't someone who's struggling. This is someone who's living a luxury lifestyle. Where is this money actually going?" It was a question I had been afraid to ask myself, but hearing it spoken aloud made the reality unavoidable. If Jessica was eating at Denver's most expensive restaurants and getting promotional manicures and potentially working in an executive role somewhere, then the money I had been sending wasn't going to basic necessities. It was funding a lifestyle that was far more extravagant than anything I could afford for myself. "I think you need to investigate this more," Amanda said gently. "I think you need to find out what's really going on with Jessica's finances before you send her another penny." That weekend, while Michael was at a work conference in Colorado Springs, I decided to do exactly that. I had never been the type of person to snoop or investigate, but the growing pile of evidence was too significant to ignore. I started with Jessica's social media accounts, going back months through her Instagram and Facebook posts, documenting every expensive restaurant, every designer outfit, every luxury experience she had shared with her followers. The pattern that emerged was stunning in its consistency. Jessica was living like someone with significant disposable income, documenting a lifestyle that included regular spa treatments, expensive workout classes, shopping trips to high-end boutiques, and dining at restaurants where a single meal could cost more than my weekly grocery budget. But scattered throughout these posts were carefully crafted stories about the struggles of freelance life, the unpredictability of entrepreneurship, the challenges of building a business from scratch. She was playing both sides, presenting herself as both successful enough to attract followers who admired her lifestyle, and struggling enough to justify asking family for financial support. It was a carefully constructed narrative that allowed her to maintain an expensive lifestyle while avoiding the actual work of earning the money to support it. But it was her LinkedIn profile that provided the most damning evidence. I found it by searching her name along with several marketing firms in Denver, and what I discovered made my hands shake as I scrolled through her professional history. According to LinkedIn, Jessica had been working as a senior marketing manager at a mid-sized digital agency for the past 18 months, with a previous role as marketing coordinator at another firm before that. Her profile described her as an experienced professional with expertise in social media strategy and brand development, with no mention of freelance work or entrepreneurial struggles. The timeline made everything clear. Jessica had been employed in steadily advancing marketing roles for most of the time she had been asking me for money, claiming to struggle with the inconsistent income of freelance work. She had been lying not just about temporary setbacks, but about the fundamental nature of her professional life. The tearful phone calls about delayed client payments, the stress about finding new projects, the uncertainty about her income, all of it had been fiction. I screenshot everything, building a digital file of evidence that documented the scope of Jessica's deception. Part of me felt sick about conducting this kind of investigation into my own sister's life, but a larger part felt vindicated. The nagging doubts I had been suppressing for months were being confirmed in ways I couldn't ignore or rationalize away. On Sunday evening, I called my parents' house, hoping to talk to my mother about what I had discovered. I wasn't sure how much to reveal, but I needed to understand if they had any awareness of Jessica's actual employment situation. My father answered the phone, sounding pleased to hear from me and immediately asking about wedding planning and how Michael was handling the excitement of being engaged. "Dad," I said after we had caught up on the basics, "I wanted to ask you something about Jessica. Has she mentioned anything to you about her work situation lately? About how her business is going?" There was a pause, and I could hear my father's voice become more careful. "Well, you know Jessica. She doesn't share a lot of details about work with us. But she seems to be doing well. Your mother saw some photos she posted from a nice restaurant last week, and she's been talking about some big projects she's working on. But she's still freelancing, right? Still building her marketing business?" Another pause, longer this time. "Sarah, is everything okay? You sound worried about something." I wasn't ready to reveal everything I had discovered, not over the phone and not without more evidence. But I pressed a little further, asking if they knew which clients Jessica was working with, or if she had mentioned any plans to transition back to full-time employment. My father's answers were vague and non-committal, confirming that Jessica had been just as careful about managing information with our parents as she had been with me. When my mother got on the phone, her tone was immediately more concerned. "Is Jessica asking you for money again?" she asked, and something in her voice suggested this wasn't the first time she had worried about this dynamic. "I've been concerned about how often she seems to need help, but she always insists it's temporary. She's been asking you for money too?" I asked, feeling a new kind of dread settle in my stomach. "Well, yes, occasionally. Nothing major, just small amounts when she has unexpected expenses. But Sarah, if you're feeling pressured to help more than you can afford, especially with the wedding coming up, you need to say no. Family helps family, but not at the expense of your own stability. Small amounts." I wondered what my mother would consider small, and whether Jessica had been as strategic with them about the frequency and size of her requests. The possibility that she was running similar schemes with multiple family members made the scope of her deception even more troubling. That night, I lay awake thinking about everything I had learned over the weekend. The evidence was overwhelming, but I still felt uncertain about how to proceed. Confronting Jessica directly felt daunting, especially given how skilled she was at emotional manipulation. But continuing to send money while knowing she was lying about her circumstances felt impossible. It was Tuesday when Jessica provided the final piece of evidence I needed, though she had no idea she was doing it. I was at work, trying to focus on a complicated client audit, when she called me during my lunch break. Her voice was different this time, more excited than distressed, though she tried to modulate her tone as she spoke. "Sarah, I have amazing news," she said, and I could hear genuine happiness underneath her attempt at careful delivery. "Remember that client I mentioned last week, the big company I was hoping to land? Well, they just offered me a contract, and it's huge. Potentially life-changing for my business." I felt my pulse quicken as I realized what she was about to ask. "That's great, Jess. Congratulations." "The only thing is," she continued, and now her voice took on the familiar tone of manufactured vulnerability, They need me to start immediately, and they want me to handle some upfront expenses for the campaign launch. It's normal in this industry they'll reimburse me once the project gets rolling, but I need to cover about $6,000 in initial costs. $6,000. For a contract that would supposedly transform her business, from a client that had just hired her for a major campaign. The story was so obviously fabricated that I almost laughed, except there was nothing funny about the realization that Jessica thought I was gullible enough to believe it. "When would you need the money?" I asked, curious to see how elaborate her fictional timeline would become. "Ideally by tomorrow," she said, her voice taking on an edge of desperation. "I know it's short notice, but this opportunity is too big to miss. And once the project launches, I'll be able to pay you back quickly, and probably won't need to ask for help anymore." The same promise she had been making for 3 years. That this would be the last time, that her business was finally about to stabilize. But now I knew she didn't have a business to stabilize. She had a job, a steady income, and a lifestyle that was being subsidized by family members who believed her carefully constructed stories about entrepreneurial struggles. "Let me think about it," I told her. "I need to check my finances and see what I can do." "Of course," she said quickly. "I understand it's a lot. But Sarah, this could really change everything for me. This could be the break I've been working toward for years." After we hung up, I sat in my car in the parking lot of my office building, staring at my phone and feeling a mixture of anger and sadness that was hard to untangle. The anger was obvious. 3 years of lies, $80,000 of my carefully saved money, countless hours of worry about her financial stability, all based on stories that were completely fabricated. But the sadness was more complex. Grief for the relationship I thought I had with my sister, for the person I thought she was. That evening, I told Michael everything. We were sitting on my couch after dinner, and I had been quiet and distracted all day, unable to focus on anything except the conversation I had had with Jessica. When he asked what was wrong, everything came spilling out. The years of financial support, the recent discoveries about her employment, the latest request for $6,000 for a fictional business opportunity. Michael listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as I explained the scope of what had been happening. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I had told him. Finally, he reached over and took my hand, his voice gentle but firm. "Sarah, this isn't your fault," he said. "You were trying to help your sister because you love her, but she's been taking advantage of that love in a really cruel way." "I feel so stupid," I said, surprised by how much relief I felt at finally sharing this burden with someone who knew me so well. How did I not see what was happening? How did I let it go on for so long? "Because you're a good person who trusts the people you love," Michael said. "Because you wanted to believe that your sister needed help, and that you were in a position to provide it. There's nothing wrong with those instincts." We talked for hours that night about what to do next, about how to handle Jessica's latest request, and whether to confront her about what I had discovered. Michael was supportive, but also practical, pointing out that the money I had been sending Jessica could have been our down payment on a house, could have funded our entire wedding, could have secured our financial future in ways that would benefit both of us. "I'm not saying this to make you feel worse," he said carefully. "I'm saying it because I think you need to understand what this has cost you, cost us. And I think you need to decide whether you're willing to keep paying that cost for someone who's been lying to you." The next morning, I made my decision. Instead of sending Jessica the $6,000 she had requested, I sent her a text message, asking if we could meet for coffee to discuss her request in person. I wanted to look her in the eye when I asked her about her employment situation, wanted to give her a chance to tell me the truth before I revealed what I had discovered. We met that Thursday evening at a coffee shop in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, close to my apartment but neutral enough that neither of us would feel territorial about the space. Jessica arrived looking polished and confident, wearing what appeared to be a new dress and carrying a handbag I recognized as being from an expensive designer. She hugged me warmly and immediately launched into excited talk about the fictional client opportunity, building on the story she had told me over the phone. "I've been thinking about your request," I said when she paused for breath. "But before I make any decisions about the money, I wanted to ask you some questions about your work situation." Something flickered across Jessica's face, Too quick for me to identify, but unmistakably wary. What kind of questions? Well, for instance, I'm curious about this client who wants you to cover upfront expenses. What's the name of the company? What kind of campaign are they planning? It seems unusual for a legitimate business to ask a contractor to cover initial costs. Jessica's response was smooth and immediate, suggesting she had anticipated this line of questioning. She provided elaborate details about a fictional company and a made-up campaign, weaving together industry terminology and plausible timelines in a way that would have been convincing if I hadn't already known she was lying. But I had done my research, and I was prepared for her performance. That's interesting, I said when she finished her explanation. It's just that when I looked up this company online, I couldn't find any information about them. No website, no social media presence, no business registration in Colorado. The change in Jessica's demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable. The confident flow of her story faltered slightly, and she took a moment longer than necessary to respond. Well, they're a smaller company, she said finally. They might not have a big online presence yet. Or, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart, they might not exist at all. Just like your freelance marketing business doesn't exist. The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, panic, calculation, and finally a kind of cold assessment that I had never seen from her before. When she spoke again, her voice was completely different, stripped of the warmth and vulnerability she had been projecting. I don't know what you think you've discovered, she said carefully, but I think you're misunderstanding my situation. Am I? I pulled out my phone and showed her the screenshots I had taken, the LinkedIn profile, the expensive restaurant photos, the evidence of her actual employment history. Because it looks to me like you've been working steady jobs while telling me you're struggling with freelance income. It looks like you've been living a luxury lifestyle while crying to me about not being able to afford basic necessities. Jessica stared at the phone screen for a long moment, and I could see her mind working, trying to find an angle that would allow her to maintain her version of events. When she looked up at me, her expression had hardened into something I barely recognized. You've been spying on me, she said, and there was genuine anger in her voice now. Going through my personal information, stalking my social media, investigating my private life. Do you realize how invasive that is? The accusation caught me off guard, and for a moment I felt the familiar guilt that Jessica was so skilled at triggering. But then I remembered the $80,000, the 3 years of lies, the engagement joy that had been complicated by financial stress I shouldn't have been carrying. I've been trying to understand why my sister has been lying to me for 3 years, I said. I've been trying to figure out where my money has actually been going, and why someone with a steady job has been pretending to struggle while living better than I do. Your money, Jessica repeated, and now her voice was sharp with contempt. Listen to yourself, Sarah. You sound like some kind of loan shark keeping track of every penny. I never asked you to keep a running tab of everything you've given me. You asked me for $6,000 yesterday for a business opportunity that doesn't exist, I said. You've asked me for money every month for 3 years while lying about your employment situation. How is that not keeping track of money? The conversation deteriorated quickly from there, with Jessica alternating between anger and manipulation, trying various strategies to regain control of the narrative. She accused me of being controlling and suspicious, claimed I was misinterpreting her social media posts, insisted that her work situation was more complicated than I understood. When those tactics failed, she switched to emotional manipulation, crying about how hard it was to live up to family expectations and how much pressure she felt to appear successful. But I had seen too much evidence, and I had spent too many hours thinking about the patterns of deception. Nothing she said could explain away the fundamental dishonesty of her requests for money, while maintaining an expensive lifestyle funded by employment she had hidden from everyone who cared about her. The coffee shop meeting ended with Jessica storming out, declaring that she was disappointed in my lack of trust and support. She left me sitting alone at the small table, surrounded by the wreckage of a relationship I was only now beginning to understand had been built on lies from the very beginning. The week following my confrontation with Jessica at the coffee shop passed in an strange kind of suspended animation. I went to work, came home to Michael, continued planning our wedding, but underneath the surface normalcy, I felt like I was waiting for something to explode. Jessica hadn't responded to any of my attempts at communication since storming out of our meeting, and the silence felt ominous rather than peaceful. It was our parents' monthly family dinner that forced everything into the open. These gatherings had been a tradition since Jessica and I were teenagers, a way for our immigrant parents to maintain family connection despite our increasingly busy adult lives. Usually held on the last Sunday of each month at their house in Lakewood, these dinners were sacred in my mother's mind, the kind of obligation that superseded work commitments, social plans, or personal drama. I had considered skipping this particular dinner, given the tension with Jessica, but Michael convinced me that avoiding family gatherings would only make the situation more complicated. He offered to come with me for moral support, and I gratefully accepted, knowing that having him there would help me maintain perspective if Jessica decided to create a scene. We arrived at my parents' house around 4 p.m, carrying a bottle of wine and the homemade dumplings that had become my traditional contribution to these meals. The familiar warmth of my childhood home usually made me feel grounded and peaceful, but today I felt anxious and on edge, hyper-aware of every sound and movement as I waited for Jessica to arrive. My parents were clearly excited to spend time with Michael in his new role as my fiancé, and my father immediately launched into enthusiastic conversation about wedding planning and future grandchildren. My mother bustled around the kitchen, preparing far more food than 4 people could possibly eat, pausing periodically to admire my engagement ring and ask detailed questions about ceremony logistics. Jessica arrived 20 minutes late, as was typical for her, but something about her entrance felt different this time. She was dressed more dramatically than usual, wearing all black with heavy makeup that looked more appropriate for a nightclub than a family dinner. She embraced our parents with theatrical warmth, made polite but distant conversation with Michael, and largely ignored me except for a brief, cold acknowledgement when she first walked in. During dinner, Jessica dominated the conversation in a way that felt calculated and performative. She told elaborate stories about her work successes, name-dropping clients and projects, with the kind of detail that would have been impressive if I hadn't known most of it was fabricated. She talked about recent travel opportunities, expensive purchases, and professional achievements with the confidence of someone who had never experienced financial struggle. I watched our parents absorb these stories with obvious pride and relief, and I realized that Jessica had been crafting a very different narrative for them than the one she had been telling me. To them, she was a successful entrepreneur whose business was thriving. The occasional requests for small amounts of money were framed as temporary cash flow issues, not fundamental financial dependence. Michael, who was hearing these stories for the first time, gave me several pointed looks across the dinner table. He knew about Jessica's actual employment situation and the extent of the money I had been sending her, so listening to her fabricated success stories must have been particularly jarring. But he maintained polite interest, asking thoughtful questions that Jessica answered with increasing elaboration. It was during dessert that everything finally erupted. My mother had been talking about wedding planning, mentioning how excited she was to help with arrangements, and expressing her hopes that both her daughters would be involved in the process. She turned to Jessica with obvious affection and said, "I'm so glad your business is doing so well now, honey. It means you'll be able to really participate in Sarah's wedding without worrying about expenses." Jessica's response was swift and venomous. "Actually, I'm not sure how much I'll be able to participate," she said, her voice taking on the wounded tone she used when she wanted to position herself as a victim. "Some people in this family have made it clear that they don't trust me or value my presence." The change in atmosphere was immediate and uncomfortable. My parents looked confused and concerned, clearly having no context for Jessica's cryptic comment. Michael shifted in his seat beside me, and I felt my heart rate increase as I realized Jessica was about to force a confrontation in front of our entire family. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" my mother asked gently, her voice already taking on the protective tone she used when she sensed Jessica was upset. "I mean that Sarah has been investigating my personal life like some kind of detective," Jessica said, her voice growing louder and more dramatic. "Going through my social media, looking up my work information, questioning everything I tell her like she thinks I'm some kind of criminal." I felt the familiar sensation of being painted as the aggressor, the family member who was causing problems by refusing to go along with Jessica's version of reality. But this time, I had evidence, and I had Michael's support, and I was tired of being manipulated into silence. I started asking questions, I said carefully, because Jessica has been asking me for money for 3 years while lying about her employment situation. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents looked shocked, their eyes moving between Jessica and me as they tried to process what I had just revealed. Jessica's face went through a rapid series of expressions before settling on righteous indignation. "I can't believe you're doing this here," she said, her voice shaking with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "At a family dinner, in front of Michael, making these accusations. This is exactly the kind of toxic behavior I was talking about." "What accusations?" my father asked, his voice sharp with confusion and growing concern. "Sarah, what money are you talking about?" So I told them everything. About the monthly transfers that had been going on for 3 years, about the emergency requests that had totaled close to $80,000, about the recent discovery that Jessica had been employed in steady marketing positions while claiming to struggle with freelance income. I showed them the same screenshots I had shown Jessica, the LinkedIn profile that contradicted her stories about entrepreneurial difficulties, the expensive social media posts that didn't align with her claims of financial hardship. My parents listened in stunned silence, occasionally asking for clarification or looking at Jessica for explanation. But Jessica had stopped trying to defend herself with facts and had instead shifted into full emotional manipulation mode. She cried about feeling judged and unsupported, claimed that her work situation was more complicated than it appeared, accused me of betraying family trust by investigating her personal information. "Even if what Sarah is saying is true," she said through tears, "is this really how we want to handle family problems? By humiliating each other in front of outsiders?" The comment about Michael being an outsider was clearly intended to make him uncomfortable and to position me as someone who was prioritizing a romantic relationship over family loyalty. But Michael responded with a calm directness that surprised everyone at the table. "I don't think anyone is trying to humiliate anyone," he said evenly. "I think Sarah discovered that someone she loves and trusts has been taking advantage of her generosity, and she's trying to understand how that happened." "Taking advantage?" Jessica's voice rose to a near shout. "I'm her sister. Family helps family. The fact that Sarah has turned this into some kind of financial transaction says more about her character than mine." "Family does help family," my mother said slowly, her voice heavy with disappointment. "But family also tells the truth to each other. Jessica, if you've been employed this whole time, why didn't you tell us? Why did you let Sarah think you were struggling?" The question seemed to deflate some of Jessica's righteous anger, and for a moment she looked genuinely vulnerable, rather than performatively wounded. But then her expression hardened again, and she stood up from the table with dramatic finality. "I don't have to justify my life choices to any of you," she said, grabbing her purse and coat. "And I don't have to sit here and be attacked by someone who's supposed to love me unconditionally." She left through the front door without saying goodbye, and the 4 of us remaining at the dinner table sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes. My parents looked shell-shocked, trying to process not just the revelation about Jessica's deception, but also the realization that family dynamics they had thought they understood were actually much more complicated and troubled. "How long did you say this has been going on?" my father asked finally, his voice quiet and sad. 3 years, I said. "Since she moved to Denver and said she was starting her freelance business." My mother shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with a kind of grief I had never seen from her before. $80,000, she repeated, as if saying the number aloud would help her comprehend its magnitude. "Sarah, honey, that's so much money. Why didn't you tell us what was happening?" It was a fair question, and one I had been asking myself since discovering the extent of Jessica's lies. "I thought I was helping her," I said simply. "I thought she really needed support while she built her business. And I guess I was embarrassed about how much it was adding up to." Michael reached over and took my hand under the table, a gesture of solidarity that my parents noticed and seemed to appreciate. The rest of the evening was subdued, with my parents asking careful questions about my finances and expressing both gratitude that I had been trying to help Jessica and concern about the impact on my own life. When Michael and I left that evening, my parents hugged us both goodbye with unusual intensity, and my mother whispered to me that she was proud of me for standing up for myself, even though it had been difficult. The drive back to my apartment was quiet, both of us processing what had just happened. Finally, Michael spoke up. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Exhausted," I said honestly, but also relieved. "I've been carrying this secret for so long, and now it's out there. Whatever happens next, at least I don't have to pretend anymore." The next few days brought a series of revelations that made the scope of Jessica's deception even clearer. My mother called on Tuesday to tell me that she had done some investigating of her own and discovered that Jessica had been asking them for money too, though smaller amounts and less frequently than she had been asking me. The story Jessica had told them was different but equally fabricated, involving medical expenses and car repairs rather than business struggles. More disturbing was my mother's discovery that Jessica had also been receiving money from our elderly grandmother, who lived on a fixed income and could barely afford to help anyone financially. Jessica had apparently convinced her that she was struggling to pay for graduate school courses that would advance her career, another complete fabrication that had resulted in our grandmother sending her several $1,000s over the past year. "I'm so angry I can barely think straight," my mother said during that phone call. "To take money from your grandmother, who has so little to begin with." I don't know how Jessica became this person. By the end of the week, the full picture had emerged. Jessica had been running essentially the same scam on multiple family members, tailoring her stories to each person's concerns and capacity to help. With me, she was the struggling entrepreneur who needed business support. With our parents, she was the successful daughter who occasionally needed help with unexpected expenses. With our grandmother, she was the devoted granddaughter investing in her education. The total amount she had received from all family members combined was staggering, well over $100,000 across 3 years. Money that could have funded multiple family vacations, helped with our grandmother's medical expenses, or been saved for legitimate emergencies. It was Amanda who pointed out the most infuriating aspect of the whole situation. We were having coffee on Friday morning, discussing the aftermath of the family dinner revelation, when she said something that stopped me cold. "You realize that Jessica has been living better than any of us this entire time," she said. "She's had her full salary from her actual job, plus thousands of dollars every month from family members. She's probably been making more money than you and Michael combined." The truth of this observation hit me like a physical blow. While I had been carefully budgeting every expense, skipping vacations, and eating at home to afford Jessica's monthly transfers, she had been living a luxury lifestyle, funded by both legitimate employment and fraudulent family support. She had been posting photos of expensive dinners that I couldn't afford while I was sending her money for basic necessities. But the most painful realization came on Saturday, when Michael and I were discussing our wedding budget and timeline. We had been planning a modest ceremony, carefully calculating every expense and making compromises based on what we could afford. As we sat at my kitchen table with spreadsheets and vendor quotes, Michael said something that made my stomach drop. "If you hadn't been sending Jessica all that money," he said gently, "we could have had any wedding we wanted. We could have bought a house. We could have started our marriage without any financial stress at all." He wasn't saying it to make me feel guilty, but the impact was devastating anyway. I realized that Jessica's deception hadn't just cost me money, it had shaped major life decisions. The small wedding we were planning, the delay in buying a home, the careful budgeting that had become second nature, all of it had been necessary because I was unknowingly funding my sister's luxury lifestyle. That weekend, Jessica finally broke her silence, but not in the way I had expected. Instead of calling to apologize or explain, she posted a long, carefully crafted message on her social media accounts about toxic family dynamics and the pain of being misunderstood by people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. The post was a masterpiece of manipulation, painting herself as the victim of family members who had turned against her during a difficult period in her life. She talked about the challenges of building a business, the stress of family expectations, and the heartbreak of being judged rather than supported by her own sister. She never mentioned the money or the lies, but she managed to make it sound like I had attacked her for no reason other than jealousy or spite. The response from her social media followers was immediate and supportive, with dozens of comments offering sympathy and encouragement. Several people shared their own stories of family drama and betrayal, creating a narrative where Jessica was part of a community of people who had been wronged by relatives who didn't understand their struggles. Reading the post and the comments made me feel sick, not because I cared about Jessica's followers' opinions, but because it showed how completely she had committed to her victim narrative. Even when confronted with undeniable evidence of her deception, she was doubling down on the idea that she was the one who had been wronged. It was Michael who helped me put Jessica's social media post into perspective. "She's doing exactly what she's always done," he said when I showed him the post. "She's creating a story that makes her the victim and everyone else the villain. The difference is that now you know it's a story." That Sunday, exactly 1 week after the disastrous family dinner, my parents came to visit my apartment. They had called ahead to ask if they could come over to talk, and their serious tone had made me nervous about what they wanted to discuss. They arrived looking older than I remembered, the stress of the past week having taken a visible toll on both of them. My mother was carrying a manila folder, and my father looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. We sat in my small living room, and my mother opened the folder to reveal a stack of financial documents. "We've been going through our records," she said, "trying to figure out exactly how much money Jessica has received from all of us. We wanted you to see the full scope of what's been happening." The documents showed a pattern of deception that was even more extensive than I had realized. Jessica had been asking different family members for money for overlapping time periods, sometimes requesting funds from multiple people for the same fabricated emergency. She had been careful to coordinate her stories so that no one would compare notes. But she had gotten sloppy in recent months, perhaps growing overconfident in her ability to manage multiple narratives simultaneously. "We've decided to cut off all financial support," my father said. "No more money for any reason, no matter what story she tells us, and we think you should do the same." My mother nodded, though she looked sad about the decision. "We also think you should consider talking to someone about getting the money back. I know she's family, but what she did was theft, essentially. You have every right to pursue legal options." The suggestion of legal action felt extreme, though I understood why they were raising it. The amount of money involved was significant enough to be worth pursuing through civil court, and Jessica's deception had been systematic and deliberate, rather than impulsive or emotional. But sitting there in my living room with my parents, looking at the evidence of 3 years of lies and manipulation, I realized that I didn't want revenge or legal satisfaction. I wanted something simpler and more fundamental. I wanted to be free of Jessica's influence on my life. "I don't want to sue her," I said finally. "I just want to stop enabling her. I want to protect my relationship with Michael and build a life that isn't constantly disrupted by Jessica's manufactured crises." My parents seemed relieved by this decision, and we spent the rest of their visit talking about practical steps for moving forward. We agreed that no one would respond to any future requests for money from Jessica, regardless of the reason or the level of apparent urgency. We decided to be transparent with other family members about what had happened, to prevent Jessica from targeting cousins or aunts who might not be aware of her deception patterns. Most importantly, we talked about rebuilding trust and relationships that had been damaged by Jessica's manipulation. My parents apologized for not recognizing what was happening sooner, for creating family dynamics that had enabled Jessica's behavior. I apologized for not being more transparent about the financial support I had been providing, for allowing the situation to escalate without seeking help or perspective. When they left that afternoon, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because the problem was solved. Jessica was still out there, still creating narratives and manipulating situations, but because I was no longer carrying the burden alone. I had allies who understood what had happened and who were committed to preventing it from happening again. That evening, Michael and I sat down with our wedding planning materials and completely reimagined our celebration. Without the financial strain of supporting Jessica, we could afford the venue we really wanted, the photographer whose work we loved, the dinner menu that would make our guests feel truly welcomed and celebrated. But more than the practical improvements, planning our wedding without the shadow of Jessica's financial dependency felt emotionally liberating. For the first time in 3 years, I was making decisions based on what Michael and I wanted, rather than what I could afford, after fulfilling my obligations to Jessica. "How does it feel?" Michael asked as we looked at pictures of a beautiful mountain venue that had previously been outside our budget. "Like I'm finally planning my own life instead of arranging it around someone else's lies," I said. 3 months later, Michael and I were married at that mountain venue, surrounded by family and friends who had chosen to be there out of genuine love and support, rather than obligation or manipulation. Jessica was not invited, and her absence felt peaceful, rather than painful. My parents walked me down the aisle together, both of them emotional but happy, proud of the life Michael and I were building together. Our grandmother, who had recovered financially from Jessica's deception with help from the rest of the family, gave a toast about the importance of honesty and authenticity in marriage. During the reception, as I danced with my new husband under string lights strung between pine trees, I reflected on how different this moment felt from what I had imagined a year earlier. Then, I had been planning a wedding around financial constraints created by Jessica's lies, worried about family drama, and wondering if I could afford the celebration I truly wanted. Now I was celebrating the beginning of a marriage built on honesty and mutual support, surrounded by people who had proven their commitment to our happiness. The money I had sent Jessica was gone, and I would never see it again, but the freedom from her manipulation was worth more than any financial recovery could have provided. Jessica herself had largely disappeared from our family's daily life. She had moved out of her expensive Denver apartment and relocated to another city, cutting contact with most family members except for occasional social media updates that suggested she was continuing to create new narratives and find new sources of support. Sometimes I wondered if she had learned anything from the exposure of her deception, if she had developed any self-awareness about the damage her lies had caused. But mostly, I tried not to think about her at all. She had taken enough of my time, energy, and money over the years. The life I was building with Michael deserved my full attention and investment. 6 months after our wedding, Michael and I bought our first house together, a cozy craftsman bungalow in a neighborhood we both loved. As we signed the mortgage papers, I thought about how different this moment might have been if I had still been sending thousands of dollars every month to support Jessica's fictional struggles. Instead, we were able to put down a substantial down payment and secure favorable loan terms, starting our homeownership journey from a position of financial strength rather than stress. When we moved in, my parents helped us paint the living room, and my grandmother contributed handmade curtains for the kitchen windows. It felt like a new beginning, in every possible way, but also like a return to something fundamental that had been lost during the years of Jessica's manipulation. We were a family again, but one built on transparency and genuine care rather than obligation and guilt. The house became a place where we hosted friends for dinner parties, where we planned future vacations and discussed dreams for our life together. It was a space that belonged entirely to Michael and me, free from the shadows of family drama or financial obligation to people who had betrayed our trust. And on quiet Sunday mornings, as I sat in our sunny kitchen drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, I sometimes felt a profound gratitude for the strength I had found to protect this life we were building. It had taken courage to confront Jessica's lies, to endure the family drama that followed, to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by years of deception. But the peace I felt in those moments, the security of being married to someone who valued honesty above all else, the freedom to make financial decisions based on our own priorities, rather than someone else's manufactured crises. All of it confirmed that choosing truth over family loyalty had been the right decision. Jessica had taught me, inadvertently, that some people will take advantage of love and generosity without ever feeling genuine gratitude or remorse. But she had also taught me that I was stronger than I had realized, capable of setting boundaries and protecting what mattered most to me, even when doing so required difficult conversations and painful realizations. The money she had taken was gone forever, but the lessons I had learned about recognizing manipulation, trusting my instincts, and prioritizing authentic relationships would serve me for the rest of my life. And in the end, that education was worth far more than any amount she could have stolen. 2 years had passed since Jessica disappeared from our lives, and I thought the chapter of her deception was finally closed. Michael and I had settled into married life with a contentment that felt almost surreal after years of financial stress and family drama. We had our house, our routines, our plans for the future, that no longer included budgeting around someone else's manufactured emergencies. Life felt stable in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. Then Amanda called me on a Tuesday morning in March, her voice tight with barely contained excitement and something that sounded like disbelief. I was getting ready for work, standing in our sunny kitchen making coffee, when my phone rang with her name flashing on the screen. "Sarah, you need to sit down," she said without preamble. "I just got off the phone with my cousin who works at the district attorney's office, and you're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you." I set down my coffee mug and leaned against the counter, feeling a familiar knot of anxiety form in my stomach. Nothing good ever came from conversations that started with instructions to sit down. "What's going on?" "Jessica's been arrested," Amanda said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background like she was reading from notes. "But not just arrested, Sarah. She's been indicted by a federal grand jury for wire fraud, mail fraud, and money laundering. We're talking federal charges, multiple victims, potentially decades in prison." The words didn't immediately compute. I found myself asking Amanda to repeat what she had said, certain I had misheard something crucial. "Jessica arrested? Federal charges?" It felt like hearing about a stranger, someone whose life had nothing to do with the sister I had grown up with, the person whose lies had dominated my family's dynamics for years. "How is that possible?" I asked, sinking into one of our kitchen chairs. "What did she do?" Amanda's voice took on the careful tone she used when delivering particularly complex information at work. "According to my cousin, who obviously can't give me details but could confirm what's public record, Jessica has been running elaborate financial fraud schemes for at least 5 years. Not just with family members, Sarah. We're talking dozens of victims, fake businesses, forged documents, cryptocurrency scams. The FBI has been investigating her for over a year." I felt like the room was tilting around me. 5 years meant that Jessica had been deceiving people for longer than she had been asking me for money. It meant that her requests to our family had been just one small part of a much larger pattern of criminal behavior. "The amount they're talking about is staggering," Amanda continued. "Over $2 million stolen from various sources. Sarah, your sister wasn't just lying to family about needing help. She was running a professional con operation. $2 million. The number was so large that it felt abstract, impossible to connect to the person who had sat in my parents' living room crying about rent money and car payments. But as Amanda continued talking, sharing what details she could gather from public records and court filings, a picture began to emerge that was both shocking and, in retrospect, entirely predictable. Jessica had been using her social media presence and fake marketing business as a front for multiple overlapping fraud schemes. She had convinced elderly victims that she was managing their investments, taking their retirement savings, and spending them on her luxury lifestyle. She had created fake crowdfunding campaigns for supposed charitable causes, collecting thousands of dollars that never reached any legitimate organization. She had even been posing as a financial advisor, offering investment services to people who trusted her fabricated credentials. The sophistication of her operation was breathtaking and terrifying. While I had thought she was simply lying about her employment status, she had actually been constructing an elaborate criminal enterprise that required fake documentation, multiple identities, and coordination across state lines. The phone calls asking me for money hadn't been desperate requests from a struggling sister. They had been calculated moves by someone who viewed family as just another source of funds for her criminal activities. "There's more," Amanda said, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. The reason the FBI got involved was because some of her victims were veterans. She had been targeting people through online support groups, convincing them she was developing apps or services specifically for military families. She took hundreds of thousands of dollars from people who thought they were investing in businesses that would help other veterans. This detail hit me with particular force, not because I had any connection to military families, but because it showed the calculating nature of Jessica's choice of victims. She had specifically targeted people who were vulnerable, who wanted to help others, who were likely to be generous with their money when presented with what seemed like worthy causes. The same instincts that had made me want to help my struggling sister had been weaponized by Jessica to steal from people who could least afford the loss. I called in sick to work that day, unable to imagine focusing on spreadsheets and client meetings while processing this information. Michael found me still sitting at our kitchen table when he came home for lunch, surrounded by printouts of news articles and court documents I had found online. "How are you handling this?" he asked, sitting down across from me and reaching for my hands. "I don't know," I said honestly. Part of me feels vindicated, like this proves that I was right to be suspicious, and that cutting her off was the right choice. But mostly, I just feel sick. All those people she hurt, all that money stolen from veterans and elderly people who trusted her. And I helped fund it, Michael. Every dollar I sent her was money she could use to look successful and trustworthy when she was targeting new victims. Michael's response was immediate and firm. "You didn't help fund anything. You were trying to help someone you thought was your sister who needed support. The fact that she was actually a criminal using that money for illegal activities isn't your fault or your responsibility. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been complicit in something terrible, even if my participation had been unknowing. The monthly transfers I had made, the $80,000 I had sent over 3 years, had all contributed to Jessica's ability to maintain the lifestyle and appearance that made her credible to future victims. In trying to be a good sister, I had inadvertently helped fund a criminal operation that destroyed other families' financial security. Over the next few weeks, more details emerged as the case moved through the court system. Jessica had been arrested in Phoenix, where she had been living under a slightly different name and running what appeared to be a legitimate consulting business. In reality, the consulting business was another front for fraud schemes, and she had been targeting retirees in Arizona with fake investment opportunities while simultaneously running online scams that reached victims across multiple states. The FBI had been tracking her for over a year, building a case that involved wiretaps, financial surveillance, and cooperation from victims in dozens of states. The investigation had started when a group of elderly victims in California realized they had all been scammed by the same person and contacted federal authorities. From there, investigators had been able to trace Jessica's activities across state lines and uncover the full scope of her criminal enterprise. Reading the details in news reports felt surreal, like learning about the secret life of someone I had never actually known. The Jessica described in court documents was methodical, manipulative, and completely lacking in empathy for her victims. She had kept detailed records of her cons, including psychological profiles of targets and strategies for maintaining their trust. She had been running her fraud operation like a business, with spreadsheets tracking income from different schemes and calendars coordinating multiple ongoing deceptions. What struck me most was how similar her tactics with family had been to her approach with strangers. The tearful phone calls, the manufactured emergencies, the promises of repayment, the way she made her financial struggles seem temporary and specific rather than ongoing and fundamental. She had been practicing on us, refining her manipulation techniques on people who loved her before deploying them against vulnerable strangers. The federal charges against Jessica were extensive and serious. Wire fraud alone carried a potential sentence of 20 years in prison, and the prosecution was seeking significant jail time given the number of victims and the amount of money involved. Her crimes crossed state lines and involved targeting vulnerable populations, factors that would likely result in enhanced sentencing if she was convicted. But perhaps more importantly for her victims, the federal investigation had resulted in the seizure of Jessica's assets. The expensive apartment, the BMW, the designer clothes, the luxury lifestyle that had made her seem successful and trustworthy to potential marks. All of it had been purchased with stolen money, and all of it was being liquidated to provide restitution to victims. I learned about the asset seizure from a victim coordinator with the FBI who contacted me 3 weeks after Jessica's arrest. The coordinator explained that family members who had provided money to Jessica were considered victims of her fraud, and that we might be eligible for restitution once her assets were liquidated and the full scope of her crimes was established. "I want you to understand that recovery is unlikely to be complete," the coordinator said during our phone conversation. "In cases like this, the amount stolen usually far exceeds the value of recoverable assets, but we are committed to returning as much money as possible to victims." The conversation was strange and formal, turning my relationship with Jessica into a matter of federal law enforcement. I had to provide documentation of all the transfers I had made, bank statements and Venmo records, that would become evidence in a criminal prosecution. The money I had sent to help my sister was now part of a federal investigation into organized fraud. But what affected me most was learning about Jessica's other victims. The victim coordinator couldn't provide specific details, but she explained that many of the people Jessica had targeted were elderly, disabled, or struggling financially themselves. Some had lost their entire life savings to her investment scams. Others had borrowed money to participate in her fake business opportunities, leaving them in debt for money that was gone forever. Your sister was particularly effective at targeting people who were isolated or going through difficult times, the coordinator explained. She seemed to have a talent for identifying people who were vulnerable to emotional manipulation. That description applied perfectly to how Jessica had approached me. I had been stressed about money, worried about my future with Michael, uncertain about my ability to afford the life I wanted. Jessica had presented herself as someone who needed help temporarily, making me feel useful and generous, while gradually increasing my financial dependence on her needs. The psychological manipulation had been just as calculated as the financial fraud. Jessica had studied her targets, identified their vulnerabilities, and crafted personalized approaches that would be most likely to succeed. With me, she had leveraged family loyalty and guilt. With elderly victims, she had used their desire to help younger people succeed. With veterans, she had exploited their commitment to supporting fellow service members. It was Michael who helped me process the anger and guilt I felt about being manipulated so thoroughly. We spent hours talking about the psychology of fraud, about how people like Jessica were able to deceive even intelligent, educated victims who thought they were too smart to fall for scams. The reason her tactics worked, he explained one evening as we sat on our back porch, is because they were based on your genuine good qualities. She exploited your loyalty, your generosity, your love for family. Those aren't weaknesses, Sarah. Those are strengths that she weaponized against you. But understanding the mechanics of manipulation didn't immediately ease the embarrassment I felt about being deceived for so long. I kept thinking about all the warning signs I had ignored, all the inconsistencies in Jessica's stories that I had explained away because I wanted to believe she was telling the truth. The turning point came when I attended a victim support group meeting organized by the FBI. I had been reluctant to participate, feeling like my losses were minor compared to what other victims had experienced. But the victim coordinator had encouraged me to attend, explaining that understanding the full scope of Jessica's crimes might help me process my own experience. The meeting was held in a conference room at a federal building downtown, and about 20 people attended. The ages and backgrounds of Jessica's victims were shocking in their diversity. There were elderly couples who had lost their retirement savings, young veterans who had been scammed out of disability payments, middle-aged professionals who had thought they were making smart investments for their children's college funds. What struck me most was how similar all our stories were, despite the different specific details. Jessica had approached each of us with personalized stories that seemed to address our particular concerns and interests. She had been patient and persuasive, building trust over time before asking for larger amounts of money. She had always had explanations for delays or problems, always had new opportunities that required just a little more investment. Listening to other victims describe their experiences with Jessica was both validating and heartbreaking. I realized that I wasn't uniquely gullible or naive. I had been targeted by someone who was exceptionally skilled at fraud and manipulation. But I also understood the devastating impact her crimes had had on people who were far less financially secure than I was. One elderly man described losing $40,000 that he had saved for his wife's medical care. A young mother talked about borrowing against her home to invest in Jessica's fake business opportunity, leaving her family facing foreclosure. A veteran explained how Jessica's theft of his disability benefits had forced him to choose between medication and rent. These stories put my own experience into perspective. Yes, Jessica had stolen a significant amount of money from me, and yes, her lies had caused stress and family conflict. But I had a stable income and a supportive partner. I had been able to absorb the financial loss without losing my home or being unable to afford necessities. Many of her other victims hadn't been so fortunate. The support group meeting also helped me understand something important about Jessica's psychology. A federal investigator who spoke to the group explained that people who commit this type of fraud often view their victims as willing participants rather than targets. In Jessica's mind, people who gave her money were making choices based on information she provided. The fact that the information was false didn't register as morally significant to her. Offenders like this often have profound deficits in empathy, the investigator explained. They understand intellectually that their actions hurt people, but they don't feel emotional connection to that harm. They're able to compartmentalize their relationships with victims, seeing them as sources of income rather than as human beings, with their own needs and vulnerabilities. This explanation helped me understand why Jessica had been able to maintain her deception for so long without apparent guilt or remorse. She wasn't experiencing internal conflict about lying to family members because she didn't emotionally process our relationship as something that required honesty or protection. We were resources to be managed, not people to be cherished. The federal case against Jessica moved quickly once charges were filed. Her defense attorney attempted to negotiate a plea agreement, but the prosecution was seeking significant jail time, given the scope of her crimes and the number of victims involved. Jessica herself remained largely silent throughout the legal proceedings, communicating only through her lawyer and showing no indication of remorse or willingness to cooperate with efforts to recover stolen funds. 6 months after her arrest, Jessica accepted a plea agreement that resulted in a sentence of 12 years in federal prison. The sentence was longer than I had expected, but it reflected the serious nature of her crimes and the prosecution's desire to send a message about targeting vulnerable populations. As part of the plea agreement, Jessica was required to cooperate with asset recovery efforts and to provide complete financial records that would help investigators trace stolen money. This cooperation was largely meaningless, since Jessica had spent most of the money she had stolen and had few remaining assets that could be liquidated for victim restitution. The restitution process took over a year to complete, but eventually I received a check for about 30% of the money I had sent Jessica over the years. It wasn't complete recovery, but it was more than I had expected, and enough to feel like some measure of justice had been served. More importantly, the resolution of Jessica's criminal case gave me psychological closure that I hadn't realized I needed. For years, I had wondered whether I was being unfair to Jessica, whether her financial struggles had been genuine, and I had been too suspicious or unsympathetic. Learning about the full scope of her criminal activities confirmed that my instincts had been correct, and that cutting off contact had been necessary for my own protection. The day Jessica was sentenced, I didn't attend the hearing, but I did receive a call from the victim coordinator with details about the outcome: 12 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Restitution ordered to all victims, though actual recovery would depend on Jessica's future ability to earn money and make payments. That evening, Michael and I went out to dinner to mark the end of this chapter in our lives. We chose a restaurant we had never been able to afford during the years when I was sending money to Jessica, and we ordered an expensive bottle of wine to celebrate not just the legal resolution but our freedom from her influence on our financial decisions. "How do you feel?" Michael asked as we sat across from each other in the candlelit restaurant. "Free," I said, and I meant it. For the first time in years, I feel completely free to make choices based on what's best for us, without worrying about how it might affect someone who was lying to me anyway. We talked about our plans for the future, about the house renovations we could finally afford, about the vacation we had been postponing, about starting a family without the financial stress that had been hanging over us for so long. All the dreams that had been deferred because of money flowing to Jessica were now possible again. But more than the practical implications, I felt emotionally liberated from the guilt and obligation that had characterized my relationship with Jessica for years. I no longer had to wonder whether I was doing enough to help her, or whether I was being selfish for questioning her stories, or whether family loyalty required me to sacrifice my own financial security for her supposed needs. The woman who was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison wasn't the sister I had grown up with, or the person I had thought I was helping. She was a criminal who had systematically targeted vulnerable people for financial exploitation, and her incarceration meant that she couldn't continue hurting others the way she had hurt so many of her victims. 3 years later, Michael and I welcomed our first child, a daughter we named Emma. As I held her in the hospital, thinking about the life we would be able to provide for her, I felt grateful that Jessica's crimes had been exposed when they were. If her fraud had continued, if I had kept sending money without ever learning the truth, Emma's childhood would have been shaped by financial stress and family dysfunction that had nothing to do with legitimate needs or reasonable requests for help. Instead, Emma would grow up in a family that valued honesty and authenticity, where financial decisions were made transparently, and where love wasn't expressed through endless financial support for manufactured emergencies. She would learn about the importance of boundaries and the difference between helping someone in genuine need and enabling someone's destructive choices. On Emma's first birthday, as we celebrated in our backyard with friends and family who had supported us through the difficult years of Jessica's deception and legal consequences, I reflected on how much our lives had changed. We owned our home, had stable finances, and were surrounded by people whose presence in our lives was based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than obligation or manipulation. My parents had also grown and changed through the experience of learning about Jessica's crimes. They had initially blamed themselves for not recognizing her deception sooner, but they had gradually come to understand that they had been targeted by someone who was exceptionally skilled at manipulation. They had become more involved in our lives, and more appreciative of the honest, stable relationship Michael and I had built together. The money Jessica had stolen was never fully recovered, and probably never would be. But the cost of her deception had been about much more than money. She had stolen years of peace of mind, caused stress in my relationship with Michael, and damaged family relationships that had taken time and effort to repair. The greatest justice wasn't her prison sentence or the partial restitution of stolen funds. The greatest justice was the life Michael and I had been able to build together once we were free from her manipulation. A life based on truth rather than lies, on genuine partnership rather than exploitation, on realistic financial planning rather than constant crisis management. Sometimes I wondered whether Jessica ever reflected on the damage she had caused, whether prison had given her any insight into the pain she had inflicted on dozens of victims who had trusted her. But mostly, I tried not to think about her at all. She had taken enough of my time and energy and emotional investment over the years. The life I was living now, with Michael and Emma and our friends and family who had proven their reliability through years of authentic relationship, deserved my full attention and appreciation. Jessica's story was finished, at least as far as our family was concerned. Our story was just beginning, and it was being written by people who chose honesty and respect and genuine care for each other. And that story was beautiful in its simplicity and truth, everything that Jessica's carefully constructed lies had never been and could never have become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.